The film Rebel Ridge came out September 6th and shot to #1 on Netflix. It depicts a former Marine's attempts to get his money back after it was taken by police through civil forfeiture. That story sounded pretty familiar to us at the Institute for Justice. But unlike the film's main character, our clients aren't vigilantes who take the law into their own hands. Instead, they fight back in court. So how accurate is Rebel Ridge's portrayal of civil forfeiture? I'm Kim Norberg, and with me is IJ attorney Kirby Thomas West. Let's find out in this special episode of Beyond the Brief, which we're calling Fact or Fiction. Caution, spoilers ahead. So, Kirby, let's just start with the big picture. According to the film, it's perfectly legal for cops to take your money without charging you with a crime. Is that fact or fiction?
Well, it sounds like it couldn't possibly be true, but this is fact. The thing that stuck out to me when I watched the film is the reaction that Terry has when the character Summer is explaining the civil forfeiture process of just totally incredulous is exactly the reaction that I get when I tell people about civil forfeiture in real life. People have this reaction of, that can't possibly be right. You're missing something, surely. But in fact, it is true that law enforcement, if they have any reason to suspect that there's something suspicious about your property, they can seize your property and hand it over to prosecutors for forfeiture without ever charging you or accusing you of having committed any crime at all.
So let's fact check some details that happen in the movie. When the officers pull Terry over, they say he'll get a letter in the mail saying that he's been sued for the money because they believe it's drug money. And before letting him go, they hand him a slip of paper. They don't have him sign anything on the side of the road, but they hand him this paper that the clerk at the courthouse says is a seizure notice. And the police chief later says there's also a form for him to disclaim the money. So, is that how all this kind of paperwork plays out in real life?
I'm going to give this one a half and half. So mostly fact with a little fiction, with the caveat that it can sometimes actually be even worse than what's portrayed. So it's true you will get a seizure notice at the scene when law enforcement takes your property. And typically that's followed up by getting a notice of intent to forfeiture in the mail. That will give you kind of the instructions of what comes next, how do I challenge this, how do I try to get my property back. But often what happens is actually on the roadside. Law enforcement will have form there, a waiver, and pressure people, basically with the implicit threat of, criminal liability and saying, we could kind of let all of this go. Just sign this form. We'll take the property off your hands and you can be on your way.
What does that form do?
And so that form says you're just turning over your property to the government, full stop. So, we've had cases that we've litigated. We had one case in which a musician was stopped in Wyoming and they seized, I think, almost $100,000 from him that he had been carrying, totally legal. But he was, under a lot of stress and pressure. Of course, it's scary to have law enforcement there saying they're going to take all your money and they might take you to the station to book you. And he wasn't really sure what the consequences would be. You're on the side of the road. You don't have a lawyer. They're representing you. And he signed this over. And essentially what the form said is, I am relinquishing all of my right to this property. I am giving this money to the law enforcement agency. We see that all the time. So it's true generally that this is the typical process. You'll get a seizure notice and then later you'll get the forfeiture notice in the mail. But sometimes it's even worse where you'll be pressured to sign away your rights to the property at the scene.
So if you're sort of presented with this form on the roadside or at the point of the stop, do you have the option to not sign it?
Of course, you have the option to not sign it, and then that will put you into kind of the typical forfeiture process where it's up to the prosecutor to file a complaint in court and start the forfeiture process against your property. And that's the kind of thing they mentioned in the movie where you'll get, I think, a civil suit against you is what they said in the mail. Although in reality, it's a civil suit against your property, as I think we'll talk about. But you can opt not to do it. It just then puts you into this kind of Byzantine forfeiture process where you have a lot of hurdles ahead of you to get your property back.
But not signing it is basically like the only way that you really have a shot.
Exactly.
Right?
The only way you have a fighting chance is to not sign a waiver like that.
So you mentioned this sort of civil suit part of this, right? So in the film, Summer explains to Terry that the lawsuit doesn't name him as an individual. It names the money, which sounds kind of crazy, but it sounds like that's true, right?
That is fact. So I was just last year in the Michigan Supreme Court representing a 2006 Saturn Ion in the case People of the State of Michigan versus a 2006 Saturn Ion. And it was a forfeiture case that we represented a client in Detroit and won and got her car securely hers again after quite a long process. But yeah, these cases have these really absurd names because it proceeds under this legal fiction that it's the property that has done something wrong and not the property owner. So unlike a criminal case where you have all of the rights of that would adhere to you from the Constitution of having a criminal case brought against you, a right to counsel, right to have the government bear the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the government is saying, we're going to sue this property that we think has been involved in a crime, and suddenly you don't have those protections anymore. You don't have the right to counsel. You often have to prove your own innocence if there are protections for innocent owners. Again, all of these constitutional protections that we take for granted don't apply because it's these very strange case names. Some other favorites of mine, I think one is United States versus 43 gallons of whiskey from the Prohibition era. You see a lot of currency cases. We've had, the state of Texas versus $94,000 in U.S. currency or something like that. And they do have these really bizarre case names.
So when the officers are initially telling Terry about forfeiture, they kind of make clear that there's sort of two routes. You can either fight this or not fight this. And they say that if he doesn't fight it, that they just kind of get the money by default. Is that a thing? Like, is there a default process?
Fact. Yes, this is true. And unfortunately, this is something that happens all the time. Partially because people might not understand what they have to do to try to fight the forfeiture process. So when a complaint is filed in court, in the more typical forfeiture cases where the prosecutor has to go to court, file a complaint against the property, I think you have usually about 60 days to respond. But if you miss that window, you've defaulted. Your property is gone. In some cases, if the law enforcement agency opts for administrative forfeiture, you don't have the opportunity to get into court at all, and you have to navigate this process where you have to file a petition to try to get your property back. And again, if you miss these deadlines, which sometimes, again, people do because they don't understand the process, they don't have a lawyer, all kinds of reasons, you're going to lose your property. But also, people often consciously just choose to do this because, as you can imagine, in cases where the value of the property is relatively low, so in the few $1,000s range, it's going to cost you more to try to navigate this legal process than it would to just than the property's worth, and it makes more sense for you just to let it go and default.
So one of my favorite, nerdy details that sort of happens in the middle of this movie is when, Terry and Summer are kind of talking about this, and he's, incredulous about how this is going on. And he asks her, which amendment is due process? And she goes, the 5th and the 14th, which is kind of a, is that true? Is that not true? Kind of how does due process play into this?
Well, it's fact to the extent that Summer was paying attention in her government classes. It is the 5th and 14th Amendment. It is, I would say, fiction to the extent that the civil forfeiture process does respect due process. So what the 5th and 14th Amendments guarantee is that the government can't take your life, liberty, or property without offering you due process of the law. And what that means can encompass a lot of different things, but in the typical cases, it means that you have the right to notice, you have the right to be heard by a fair, impartial tribunal, and these kind of typical things that we think about when we think about our criminal justice system in the United States. Again, as I kind of mentioned already, and we've talked about, the civil forfeiture process lacks a lot of these, including often the right to be heard promptly. This is something that's come up in recent case law, in which the Supreme Court has said that you actually don't have, in the context of civil forfeiture, a right to a prompt hearing immediately after the seizure to try to get your property back right away, which means that you can be waiting months and months and months to even ever get into a court to contest your forfeiture.
And this is something that you kind of hinted at before, but Terry finds out kind of that he can fight to get the money back, but it'll, as Summer explains it, take most of a year and cost twice what he's owed.
Yeah, this is absolutely fact. Except, again, I would say fiction to the extent that Summer underestimates a little bit how long this process can take. It's absolutely true, as I mentioned, that in many cases, the cost of trying to contest a forfeiture, if you want to hire a lawyer and go through this process, is just going to be more than whatever the value of the property that was seized from you. This happens all the time, and people opt just not to pursue it. In terms of the time frame that you're looking at, though, it can be much, much more than a year. The case that I just mentioned, where we had a win in the Michigan Supreme Court this year. So it's 2024. We just had this win in the Michigan Supreme Court a couple months ago. That civil forfeiture case was filed against our client Stephanie Wilson's car back in 2020. We're looking at 4 years from the initiation of this forfeiture proceeding against a 2006 Saturn Ion for an alleged $10 drug deal that was not ever claimed to have been committed by Stephanie, but committed near her car by other people. And then we're looking at 4 years for a final determination that no, Stephanie's car is hers and the state of Michigan can't keep it through civil forfeiture.
Yeah, IJ has, I think, 103 cases right now, and the oldest case on our docket is a forfeiture case out of Arizona that's more than a decade old. So, yeah. This stuff can take forever.
Yeah.
The officers who stopped Terry tell him that if he answers the sort of forfeiture and fights to get his money back, that they'll arrest him and throw him in jail. The police chief later doubles down on this and says that Terry faces felony charges if he keeps trying to get his money back. Is that fact or fiction?
I think I'm going to give this one mostly fiction in terms of the forthrightness, which was the law enforcement officer telling you expressly, like, give us this money or we are going to file a felony charge against you. I don't think that happens very much in a stop, as it did in Terry's case in the film. However, I think that threat is implicitly there. And so when you have these situations like we were talking about with the roadside waiver, I think that's the undercurrent there. That's kind of the elephant in the room, that like, okay, if the law enforcement officer is telling me, if you sign this form, you can go and we're done here, then, the necessary implication there is that if you don't sign this form, we might not be done here. And,
right. ...
question mark, what might happen next?
What are you going to do?
So I think that's a little bit of a mix. I don't think it often plays out as explicitly as it did in the film, but I think that it's a huge problem that is the undercurrent there when you're in these kind of situations with forfeiture.
And we have seen clients be retaliated against for their lawsuits, particularly in the forfeiture context, right?
Absolutely, yes. So we have a big forfeiture case out of Detroit. I've kind of mentioned one of our clients in Detroit already, Stephanie Wilson. She was one of the plaintiffs in our federal class action lawsuit challenging broadly the constitutionality of Wayne County's vehicle forfeiture program. Another named plaintiff in that suit, Robert Reeves, just a few days after he became a plaintiff in this federal civil rights litigation, and after 6 months of Wayne County having his car and doing nothing with it, suddenly they filed criminal charges against him for crimes that they allege were related. He had those charges were dismissed, and then a second time they brought it against him. They had alleged that he had been involved in a theft ring of rental equipment from a Home Depot. Interestingly, though, they had alleged that he had received the stolen property. They didn't bother going through the hassle of charging the people who had actually alleged to have committed the thefts and stolen the property. Only Robert, of these many people alleged to have been involved, was ever charged, and it was clear that this was in retaliation for trying to take a stand against the vehicle forfeiture program, and so we are representing him in a First Amendment retaliation lawsuit as well.
As Terry is sort of digging into what's going on here and, how forfeiture works, he's told at one point that forfeiture is supposed to help the feds fight cartels. Is that fact or fiction?
So this one I'm definitely going to give a fiction. So it's true. That's what defenders of civil forfeiture always do say, is that this is a tool that law enforcement needs to bring down drug cartels, to try to curb drug crime. But the research has shown that's just simply not the case. So we have a great strategic research team here at the Institute for Justice. They've done a lot of digging into this issue of saying, what is the actual on-the-ground impact of civil forfeiture? And what they found is, first of all, the kinds of property that is taken through civil forfeiture is not these multi-million-dollar sums from drug lords. It's a couple $1,000s from average citizens. So the targets are not the kind of cartels that the pro-civil forfeiture folks would like to have you believe. But then also, if you look at the impacts of civil forfeiture, and what our strategic research team has found is that it can actually reduce crime closure rates because it's diverting law enforcement resources from actually solving crimes to looking for ways to kind of raise revenue and seize property through civil forfeiture, which is a lot easier than actually proving that somebody committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because the movie kind of again and again and again kind of hits this idea that the police department and the chief in particular, this sort of like corrupt chief, are, doing this forfeiture to raise money. There's sort of I'm going to highlight just a couple of details. At one point, a clerk at the courthouse tells Terry he can't help. And they have this exchange about where Terry says, well, the seal that's on this notice of forfeiture that I got is the same as the seal on the door. And the clerk responds, that's also the same as the seal on my paycheck, which is kind of a, pretty clear illustration of what's going on there. At one point, the police chief calls forfeiture funds the department's survival. And he says, not only do we have to find our own money, we've got to turn a profit. He says that the cash they've seized is the operating budget for the department for the next 2 quarters. And he also at some point says that it's all legally seized and it's all going back into the community. A judge at one point, like a retired judge, explains that the department started doing these forfeitures to keep the department from being handed over to state police, and that forfeiture funds not just the department, but the entire town. He says that the money flows back into debt service and payroll and public works. So, all of that is to say, the big question here, do police departments really get to pocket the seized cash? And is that factored into municipal budgets?
So this is absolutely fact. Law enforcement does get to keep the proceeds of civil forfeiture, and that can vary from state to state. There's a few states who have, rectified this problem, but in most cases, law enforcement is able to keep the vast majority of forfeiture proceeds for their own budget, which, as you see in the movie, creates obvious incentive problems where law enforcement knows that if they get more cash, they get more vehicles, that money is going into their department funds for the budget for the next year. And I love how in the movie, actually, some specific expenditures that they talk about were actually from real life. It's like they had a consultant at IJ, as we were talking about when we talked about watching this movie. They mention in a kind of throwaway line that the department had a margarita machine that they bought with forfeiture money. That's a true story. There was actually a law enforcement agency that purchased a margarita machine with civil forfeiture funds. They didn't mention that, as in the real life case, where they also bought, lots of alcohol to go with the margarita machine and kegs and beer. So this is, this kind of stuff is coming from true stories from real life funding of our real life expenditures from civil forfeiture funds. And as you were talking about, Kim, the fact that they're talking about trying to be almost sympathetic in a way that the bad guys in the movie are saying, we need this for the community. We need this to fund our budgets, and, woe is us. We won't have enough money to operate. I think that just rings so hollow for so many reasons. First of all, again, you have this huge problem where you're diverting law enforcement resources, right? What do we want our law enforcement officers doing? We want them keeping our communities safe. We want them enforcing actual criminal activity, trying to, mitigate criminal activity. We don't want them looking for people that they think are good targets to fund their budgets. It's just a huge waste of their time and their resources at the cost of actually keeping people safe. And then, of course, you have the problem of, if we're talking about how much money should law enforcement get, or how much money should any kind of government agencies get, that should be done through the democratic process, and revenue should be raised from the people in a way that is transparent to them. And it shouldn't be, you can roll the dice and get really unlucky and have your life savings taken for no reason to fund your municipal budget.
So at one point, Terry goes to the police station and he offers, for, specificity, it was $36,000 that was taken from him. And so he goes to the police station and he offers to let them keep $26,000 of it. And all he wants is $10,000 to bail his cousin out of jail. and the police chief doesn't accept that offer. Is that scenario fact or fiction?
I'm going to give this one a fiction, and the reason for that is law enforcement would absolutely take that deal, and in fact, they often make that deal. So as we've been talking about, this has been, come up a few times of how much more it can take to actually go through the effort to try to get your property back than the value of the actual property. So what you see often is law enforcement or the government, knowing that the deck is so thoroughly stacked in their favor, the government will come to someone and say, you know what, let's settle this. We'll give you back X portion, X percentage of your money, and we'll call it a day. Everybody goes on their way. So if you were going to law enforcement to make that offer, to going to the government to make that offer affirmatively, they would absolutely take that deal. And in fact, they often make those deals themselves.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one last question related to the movie that's actually not related to civil forfeiture. But there's this side conversation at one point between Summer and Terry where she explains that she's a recovering addict and she had committed a felony, some sort of like theft, many years ago while she was using. And she's really worried about helping Terry because if this record of hers becomes unsealed, it would be considered a crime of moral turpitude, which is a real phrase that they really use in this film, that would prevent her from being able to work. Is that fact or fiction?
Well, I'm not sure about the specific job that Summer had in the movie, but in general, this is fact. And again, another reason why I'm suspicious that there might be an IJer with a secret side job at Netflix. This is something that we litigate all the time in our Fresh Start cases, where states will have these good moral character requirements for certain jobs, where they'll say you can't be licensed to work in this profession or this career unless you haven't committed any crimes of moral turpitude, or you've established you have good moral character, which if you've committed any kind of felony could mean that you don't have good moral character. As I think you've kind of indicated, this is a very murky standard and gives the government a lot of leeway to say who's good enough to have a certain kind of job, and can be really problematic for people who are trying to turn their life around and get back on their feet and earn an honest living. So I think another great thing for folks to look into if they're interested in some of the messages of this movie.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Kirby. I think our big takeaway here is that, most of the stuff that we see in this movie is fact. And to the extent that that some of it is fictionalized, it's really that civil forfeiture is even worse than this movie makes it seem.
Truth is stranger than fiction.
Thanks so much, Kirby.
Thanks, Kim.
That's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.